Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. We're in New York at the UN General Assembly. Our guest today is Helle Thorning-Schmidt. She was the former Prime Minister of Denmark. She's now CEO of Save the Children International. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot.
I want to begin with something I read and that Save the Children really highlighted, and that's really frightening, some would say even sickening maybe. Over 500,000 children in conflict areas could die from extreme hunger by the end of this year.
Yeah.
It means one child every minute.
Yeah. It's a crazy and staggering figure, and we are in 2018. We're not in a different century, and this is still happening. And that is many reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that the nature of war has changed enormously, and in many ways the nature of war has changed, so it's all-out wars, where there is besiegement of towns, where there's attacks on places that should be safe places for children. And that actually means that the way that wars are fought these days are more dangerous for children than they were before. And that's why our figures are showing that there are more children living in a conflict zone now than 20 years ago, and being very affected to the point where they can die from starvation.
Right, because a famine, people think about the 1980s, Ethiopia,
Absolutely.
and so on. And now it's back. I mean, those figures are up 20% from just 2 years ago.
Yeah, that is why this is crazy. This is not some climate disaster. This is not something that came with nature.
This is man-made.
This is man-made. These are man-made disasters. And if we look at the wars that we hear so much about in Syria, which we heard about so many years, it's lasted longer than World War II now, the Syrian war. In Yemen, which is a devastating civil war, what we are seeing is man-made, and of course then we are urging man in the UN building, for example, today, to try to do what they can to finish this suffering, because the suffering is enormous. We are talking, a couple of years back, we decided on the Sustainable Development Goals as a global community. On some of those goals, for example, hunger, we are going backwards because of the wars that are happening today, because wars today are targeting children. And that's why we in Save the Children are not hesitating to say that wars of today is actually wars on children because of the way they're being fought.
I want to go into Yemen.
Yeah.
Obviously, the situation is getting from bad to very bad to even worse. The figures there are terrible. The children at risk of famine are over 5 million. We're talking about a country of 28 million.
Exactly.
You went there recently.
There,
people are talking about it as probably the worst humanitarian catastrophe.
I was there just before the summer, and we don't hesitate to say that the worst place to be a child right now is in Yemen. And yesterday I checked up with our team on the ground there. They're actually working many places in Yemen, but also in Hodeidah, which is a city port which is now almost under besiegement. So that is the situation right now. And the worst thing is that things are getting worse, not better in Yemen. What does that mean? That means that every day you have 3/4 of the population, 22 million, waking up not knowing where their meal will come from. They are completely dependent on assistance from outside. They wake up, they don't know where their first meal, that meal of the day is coming from. That's how poor they are. It means that we have 400,000 children who are on the brink of famine. They suffer from severe acute malnutrition, which is the most extreme form of hunger. I've met some of those children. I sat with a baby in my arms. She was 8 months old. She weighed the same as a newborn. And I think that if we hadn't been able to help her mother and that child that week, she would not have lasted the week out, that child. That's what famine looks like. And the reason why I want to describe it is because we can do much more to help children of Yemen right now if we push our governments, everyone who has something to say to the warring parties in that region, to try to come to the negotiation table or at least deconflict the situation.
But that's not happening.
It is not happening. It's going the opposite direction. And what is actually happening is that a city like Hodeidah, which is a port city,
80% of the aid and food comes through Hodeidah.
Exactly, and that was also before the war. That was the case. Now it is an extremely important place where things can get in, and that's why it's also important to the two parties in this civil war that's happening in Yemen. So both want control of a city. How do you get control? That is by making sure that your troops get in there, and that means you have to block the roads, and that means actually that people cannot leave Hodeidah, and we cannot get access with humanitarian aid or anything else that they might need in Hodeidah. It's a horrific situation.
Who is to blame? Who is to blame?
Well,
there are two sides on the conflict.
Yeah, there's always two sides. And I come from a humanitarian agency, and I, of course, used to be in politics, but I also think it's extremely important that we don't go into who's to blame, who's to blame. What we know in Yemen, for example, is there are two warring parties. They have both committed very grave violations.
War crimes?
I'm not going in there. Grave violations. Both sides have done that, and hopefully both sides will be held accountable. But right now, what I would like to see is a deconflicting of the situation, perhaps even a ceasefire, so we can get access with humanitarian access. There's no one on the ground, but we could help if we could get access to those children who need us.
Do you think Western countries, first and foremost the United States, should do more to pressure one of the two sides, essentially the coalition led by Saudi Arabia? We've seen reports recently that there won't be such pressure because the US wants to sell arms to Saudi Arabia.
I think it's more complex than that. This is also one of those proxy wars that takes place in the region, and that is why it becomes extremely complex. But I'm urging any government who has any influence in that region and on any of the warring parties to engage and also talk about human rights, talking about protecting children's lives. This is what we're talking about now. And I can feel that everyone is moved by the suffering of children. No one wants children to die from hunger, which is basically what they're doing. And let's not forget all the other diseases that come when a child is extremely fragile. If a child is fragile, it will catch pneumonia, it will die from a simple disease like diarrhea, it will die from cholera, a disease that we haven't talked about in Europe for 100 years. So these are the things we are talking about. And you're asking me who should act. I think anyone who has any capacity or any leverage of the warring parties in Yemen should try to create a situation
very
where
soon, because
oh yeah, now better than tomorrow,
because the children of
things are getting worse, and we hear about that. That's why I spoke to the people that we have on the ground in Hodeidah. It's horrific stories that you hear, and also shelling and bombing on places where it should be peaceful, should be sanctuaries, schools, hospitals, that should be safe places for children.
I want to get to the American President Donald Trump. He gave a speech to the United Nations General Assembly, and he said a few things. He said, I'm quoting him, "We're only going to give foreign aid to those who respect us and, frankly, to our friends." What's your reaction?
Well, I'd like to see what the American government comes up with. Let's not forget that the US administration is one of the most generous, or is the most generous donor of aid in the whole world.
That's going to change, obviously.
We are all appreciating that, and I think the Americans do it for many reasons. First of all, it's a compassionate country. There's a lot of people who pay their taxes and also think it's good that US is a compassionate country and want to help across the world, and we deeply, deeply appreciate that. And thank the US and the citizens of American citizens for the help they're giving to so many people. So that's why I'm also hoping that what has driven that passion that has driven American aid for so many years, that will still be in the government here, and also backed, of course, by Congress, that we will hopefully also in the future see a very generous American government. So
if I translate what you're saying, you're hoping that the people of America and people in Congress will not listen to what Trump just said.
We don't know what he was saying. This was a headline, and we don't know what the...
But there is concern about cutting
aid. Of course, we are concerned every day that there will be cuts, but I also want to underline that US have been an incredibly generous donor for many years. I believe they have done that out of compassion for people in other parts of the world, but also perhaps because they feel that that's in the self-interest of the US to be able to shape how the world is looking. So I'm hoping that those things will still play a role and the US will still be an active participant in global affairs, including being part of the humanitarian system, trying to help people that need it the most.
I want to get to Europe. Obviously, you were Prime Minister of Denmark. You participated in many of the European Union drama over the years.
Yes, you could say that.
Now there's Brexit, there's concern, but there's maybe a more fundamental questioning about the survival maybe of the European Union.
Yeah.
We see populist parties growing everywhere, including in your countries. There's a lot of talk against immigration. Are you worried?
I'm always worried about the European Union. I think this is one of the greatest inventions that we ever had in Europe.
Is it in danger?
I don't think that it is. The European Union has proved to be extremely resilient. I've been part of European decision-making for 20 years. I was also a member of the European Parliament. So I've seen the European Union being extremely resilient. We had the financial crisis. We had meetings when we discussed whether the euro could actually survive, whether some member states would be able to open the banks the day after. So we've been through a lot of different crises in the European Union. And my experience is that even though it's slow and we discuss and it's not always clear what we come out of in the European Council meetings, for example, we always find good solutions. So I think we are in a situation where there's massive challenges that is in front of us. And
what's
of course,
the biggest challenge?
Brexit. We need to find a good solution for the UK, but also, of course,
one will be found
for the European Union. But if you ask me, is the European Union in a crisis? I will answer that I think we have proved to be extremely resilient. We will find solutions to all those issues
including
facing
Brexit?
us. Including Brexit, yeah, there will be found solutions because that is what we do in the European Union, and that is one of the strengths of the European Union.
Helle Thorning-Schmidt, thank you very much for being on the France 24 interview here in New York. Thank you very much for watching it.